Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio-visual podcast series focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio-video podcast series has 54 short speeches on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of his multi-dimensional personality. Well, friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the kind of grand vision that he had seen for our country as a whole. This is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. Well, friends, in this episode 36, I would like to continue our discussion of Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar as an anthropologist. In the last episode, I talked about Dr. Ambedkar's anthropological classic, Who Were the Shudras? Today, we turn to another classic by Dr. Ambedkar in anthropology, social anthropology to be precise. The title of this book is The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Became Untouchables. This is a provocatively original treatise which was first published in October 1948. This book has been dedicated to the memory of Nandnar, Ravidas and Chokhamela, the three renowned saints who were born among the untouchables and who, by their piety and virtue, won the esteem of all. The motivation for writing this book, this great treatise, has been explained by Dr. Ambedkar in the preface of the said book. This is what he has said. This book may be taken as a pioneer attempt in the exploration of a field so completely neglected by everybody. The book deals not only with the origin of untouchability, but it also deals with almost all questions connected with it. It will be found that the book points to a new way of looking at the old things. Dr. Ambedkar also says, I do not want anything more from my critics than a fair and unbiased appraisal, unquote. So let's start with the content of the book. Let me present to you a very brief summary of this wonderful treatise. Dr. Ambedkar begins, and I'm going to give this summary in Dr. Ambedkar's own words, but I must say that this is a very short summary of a magnificent book. So to get full details, one has to go to the original or the bigger summary that I have presented in my books. So here it goes. Dr. Ambedkar says, untouchability is a notion of defilement, pollution, contamination, and the ways and means of getting rid of that defilement. In the matter of pollution, there is nothing to distinguish the Hindus from the primitive or ancient peoples. But there is another form of untouchability observed by the Hindus. It is the hereditary untouchability of certain communities. Such a list of communities was presented by the government of India way back in 1935. Dr. Ambedkar says this type of untouchability among Hindus stands in a class by itself. The impurity of untouchables of India is permanent. They are born impure, they are impure while they live, they die the death of the impure, and they give birth to children who are born with the stigma of untouchability affixed to them. It is a case of permanent hereditary strain which nothing can cleanse. Moreover, the Hindu society insists on segregation of untouchables. This is a fundamental feature of untouchability as it is practiced by the Hindus. Untouchability among Hindus is a unique phenomenon unknown to humanity in other parts of the world. Dr. Ambedkar then turns to the problem of habitat of untouchables. He says, or he asks us, how did the untouchable come to live outside the village? The Shastras say that the Antijas should live and have their abode outside the village. What made them or forced them to do so? Primitive society was no doubt nomadic. It was migratory and its wealth was cattle. When primitive society learned the art of farming and cultivating land, wealth changed its form from cattle to land. With this change, primitive society became settled at some place. All tribes did not take to settled life at the one and the same time. Some became settled and some remained nomadic. Also, the tribes were never at peace with each other. They were always at war with each other. The nomadic tribes had come to realize that the settled tribes were doubly wealthy. So, the nomadic tribes systematically organized raids on the settled tribes with the object of stealing their wealth belonging to the settled tribes. Continuous tribal warfare was the normal life of the primitive tribes. In a tribal war, it often happened that a tribe, instead of being completely annihilated, was defeated and routed. In many cases, a defeated tribe became broken to bits. As a consequence of this, there always existed in primitive times a floating population consisting of groups of broken tribesmen roaming in all directions. The broken men had to live as stray individuals. They did not know who would attack them and to whom they should go to for protection. That is why shelter and protection became the problem of the broken men. We can say that the two struck a bargain where the broken men agreed to do the work of watch and ward for the settled tribes, and the settled tribes in exchange agreed to give them food and shelter. Dr. Ambedkar then raises a question: where were the broken men to live? In the midst of a settled community or outside the settled community? In deciding this question, two considerations must have played a decisive part. One consideration is that the blood relationship. The second consideration is the strategy. Both of these considerations were decisively in favor of placing their quarters outside the village. The untouchables were originally only broken men. It is because they were broken men that they lived outside the village. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to say, and I quote, "In my view, the word Antya means end of the village. It tells us that there was a time when some people lived inside the village and some people lived outside the village. And those who lived outside the village, that is to say, the Antya of the village, were called Antyaja. For example, the Mahar caste in the state of Maharashtra. According to Dr. Ambedkar, it was the notion of untouchability that perpetuated the difference between tribesmen and non-tribesmen in another form, namely between touchables and untouchables. Untouchability is the new factor which prevented the amalgamation from taking place, with the result that the system of separate quarters has become a perpetual and a permanent feature of the Indian village. Then Dr. Ambedkar focuses his attention on the old theories of the origin of untouchability. Dr. Ambedkar says, let's examine the theory of racial difference as the origin of untouchability. He says, according to Mr. Rice, there have been two invasions of India. The first is the invasion of India by the Dravidians. They conquered the non-Dravidian aborigines, the ancestors of the untouchables, and made them untouchables. The second invasion is the invasion of India by the Aryans. The Aryans conquered Dravidians and made them Shudras. This is the theory given by Mr. Rice. Now, according to Dr. Ambedkar, this theory is too mechanical and a mere speculation, and too simple to explain a complicated set of facts relating to the origin of Shudras and the untouchables. In the ancient Indian history, we do often come across four names: the Aryans, Dravidians, Dasas, and Nagas. Are these the names of different races, or are they merely different names for a people of the same race? The general assumption is that they are different races. According to Dr. Ambedkar, we do not know whether the word Aryan is a term indicative of race. Historians have made a mistake in proceeding on the assumption that the Aryans were a separate race. A greater mistake, according to Dr. Ambedkar, lies in differentiating Dasas from the Nagas. Dasas are same as Nagas. Dasa is a Sanskritized form of the Indo-Iranian word Dahak, who was the king of Nagas. Consequently, the Aryans called the Nagas after the name of their king Dahak, which in its Sanskrit form became Das, a generic term applied to all the Nagas. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to ask, who were the Nagas? Undoubtedly, they were non-Aryans. The mention of Nagas in the Rig Veda shows that Nagas were very ancient people. It must also be remembered that the Nagas were in no way uncivilized people. Not only did Naga people occupy a high cultural level, but history shows that they ruled a good part of India. Then, who are the Dravidians? The popular view is that the Dravidians and Nagas are names of two different races. Nonetheless, according to Dr. Ambedkar, it is a fact that Dravidians and the Nagas are merely different names for the same people. It is natural to ask, Dr. Ambedkar says, why the term Dravidian has come to be restricted to South India if they are really Nagas. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the word Dravid is the Sanskritized form of the word Tamil. It is the name of the language of the people and does not denote the race of the people. Tamil was not merely the language of South India, but it was the language of the whole country. In fact, it was the language of Nagas throughout India. The Nagas in North India gave up Tamil, which was their mother tongue, and adopted Sanskrit in its place. The Nagas in South India retained Tamil as their mother tongue and did not adopt Sanskrit, the language of the Aryans. This is the real reason why the people of South India have come to be called Dravidians. They are only two different names for the same people. Nagas was a racial or cultural name, and Dravida was their linguistic name. Thus, the Dasas are the same as the Nagas, and the Nagas are the same as the Dravidians. In other words, what we can say about the races of India is that there have been, at the most, only two races in the field, the Aryans and the Nagas. Dr. Ambedkar cites two studies, one in Maharashtra by Risley and another one in Punjab by Mr. Rose. The results of these studies flatly contradict the theory that the untouchables are racially different from the Aryans or Dravidians. The racial theory of origin of untouchability must therefore be abandoned. According to Dr. Ambedkar, another theory of origin of untouchability is based on the unclean and filthy occupations of untouchables. Evidence about the Aryans shows that the Aryans were like other people, and their notion of purity and impurity did not fundamentally differ from those of other ancient people. The Narada Smriti, for example, shows that the Aryans did not mind at all engaging themselves in filthy occupations. The theory of filthy occupation as an explanation of untouchability is therefore not tenable. Dr. Ambedkar then turns to new theories of origin of untouchability. According to Dr. Ambedkar, the census report for the year 1910 marked a new departure from the prevailing practice. Among other things, it shows three things. One, the untouchables are not served by good Brahmins as family priests at all. Two, the untouchables have their own priests reared from themselves. Third is that untouchables eat beef and do not show reverence to the cow. We must ask why the Brahmins refused to officiate at the religious ceremonies of the broken men. What is the basis of that antipathy? This antipathy can be explained on one hypothesis, and it is that the broken men were Buddhists. As such, they did not revere the Brahmins, did not employ them as their priests, and regarded them as impure. The Brahmins, on the other hand, disliked the broken men because they were Buddhists and preached against them with contempt and hatred. The hatred and contempt preached by the Brahmins was directed against Buddhists in general and not against the broken men in particular. Since untouchability stuck to broken men only, it is obvious that there was some additional circumstance which has played its part in fastening untouchability upon the broken men. Can we say that the broken men came to be treated as untouchables because they ate beef? The correlation between untouchability and the use of dead cow is great. The new theory receives support from the Hindu Shastras. We may conclude that while the broken men were exposed to scorn and contempt on the ground that they were Buddhist, the main cause of their untouchability was their beef eating. The theory of beef eating as the cause of untouchability also gives rise to many questions. And Dr. Ambedkar addresses all those questions and then says, Buddhism was at one time the religion of the majority of the people of India. It continued to be the religion of the masses for hundreds of years. As a result of the spread of Buddhism, the Brahmins had lost all power and prestige. The Buddhists had rejected the Brahminic religion, which consisted of yajna and animal sacrifice, particularly of the cow. The objection to the sacrifice of cow had taken a strong hold in the minds of people, in the minds of masses, especially as they were the agricultural population. And the cow was a very useful animal. The Brahmins could do nothing to improve their position against the Buddhists except by giving up the sacrifice of the cow. What is truly astonishing is the fact that cow killing was made a mahapataka, a moral sin or a capital offense by the Gupta kings who were champions of Hinduism. Why should a Hindu king have come forward to make a law against cow killing which was granted by the laws of Manu? The answer is that the Brahmins had to suspend or abrogate a requirement of their Vedic religion in order to overcome the supremacy of the Buddhist bhikkhus. The Brahmins made the cow a sacred animal. This made beef eating a sacrilege. The broken men became guilty of that sacrilege. Once the cow became sacred and the broken men continued to eat beef, there was no other fate left for the broken men except to be treated as unfit for association, that is to say, as untouchables. The question that arises now is that why did the broken men not stop eating beef? The answer is that they could not afford it. The flesh of the dead cow was their principal sustenance. Moreover, carrying the dead cow had become an obligation, though originally it was a privilege. As they could not escape carrying the dead cow, they did not mind using the flesh as food in the manner in which they were doing previously. So, in sum, what Dr. Ambedkar is saying is that there was a time when the village in India consisted of a settled community and a broken man, and that though both lived apart, the former inside the village and the latter outside it, there was no bar on social intercourse between the members of the settled community and the broken men. But when the cow became sacred and beef eating became a taboo, society became divided into two. The settled community, which became touchable community, and the broken men became an untouchable community. There is a lot more in this book, but one has to really read the original to get a hang of this magnificent book. Or you can look at the extensive summaries that I have provided in my writings. Well, friends, we can stop this session here. But before I leave, I would like to remind you that if you like this podcast series, please like it, please subscribe to it, please share it. So long until we meet again real soon. Thank you. Namaskar.